Kia ora, hello. I'm Áine Kelly-Costello, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to give the keynote presentation for the Mobility Matters conference. And I'd like to thank the organizers, Amy, Holly, and Samantha, for inviting me and for working with me on this. So my presentation today is called Designing for Who? Making disabled people visible within climate justice and transport planning. And to give a bit of an overview of that, I'll start off by talking a little about me and then why we're talking about disability and climate justice, to give some context and introduce some key terms and frameworks. So ableism, climate justice, disability justice, and then I will spend a little while connecting some of the principles of disability justice to climate justice, so showing how they link. And then in line with this conference's theme, we'll talk a bit about ideas for designing accessible and climate-friendly mobility with disabled people in mind. So a little bit about me. I'm a multiply disabled campaigner and storyteller. I'm blind and chronically ill. I mainly grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I use she and they pronouns. I'm white, and all the countries that I've lived most of my life are global north countries, high income countries. I wrote my master's thesis on climate journalism, and I've also worked as a journalist and have an interest in communications and framing. And on this slide in the image, I'm sitting on my couch in the living room, and there's some bookcases in the background. So climate campaigning wise, for me, that's mainly been with the grassroots climate justice organization 350.org, campaigning for fossil fuel divestment. So on this slide, there's an image with 4 students, including myself, in our graduation attire, and we're standing outside and we're holding up a banner which reads, "Stop funding coal, oil, and gas." So that was part of the divestment campaign, using graduation as an opportunity there. I have worked with climate campaigning organizations as well to orient them towards access and inclusion for disabled people. And I've been involved in some wider disability advocacy as well. So for accessibility law, migration rights, disability pride, independent living, and political participation. So I have an interest in these overlapping areas of how we communicate climate breakdown, climate justice, and disability justice. So why climate justice and disability justice? At the moment, I think the pandemic feels a lot more immediate to our daily lives, but it's also the case that 85% of the world's population, so most of us, lives in areas being impacted by climate breakdown now. And the reference for that is Callahan et al. 2021. And it's really easy to feel overwhelmed and hopeless in the face of climate catastrophe. I think we all do, at least some of the time. I don't think there's any escaping it. But understanding the roots of climate breakdown can help to know where we can find hope, I think, as well. And the roots of the destruction ravaging our planet have a lot in common with the systems of oppression that treat disabled people as less worthy. So that's what we're going to talk about quite a bit. And once we understand that, then we can focus on solutions to these related, overlapping, interlinking systemic failings at the scale that we need. So I wanted to introduce this slightly provocative question, but one that has been on, I'd say, most disabled and immunocompromised people's minds for the last couple of years. Are disabled lives worthy? So the pandemic has thrown into relief unconscious biases which really devalue disabled people's lives. And one example of that would be the abled privilege that we saw in the CDC director's comments in January, where she implied that the deaths of people with pre-existing conditions were not particularly concerning. And in response to that, a disability advocate, Kaylee Hill, has written a piece where it says, "I feel discarded, left behind like trash. Being a disabled person in America means you come to the realization fairly quickly that policymakers and the general public have a particular contempt for your existence." And another really great piece on this theme came from disabled mixed race queer organizer Mia Mingus. And Mia has written a piece called "You Are Not Entitled to Our Deaths." And in that piece, Mia writes, "We will not trade disabled deaths for abled life. We will not allow disabled people to be disposable or the necessary collateral for the status quo. We will not look away from the mass illness and death that surrounds us, or from a state machine that is more committed to churning out profit and privileged comfort with eugenic abandonment." So no mincing the words there. You can also look for more on this theme to the hashtags "nobody is disposable" and hashtag "my disabled life is worthy." And I bring all this up because responses to climate breakdown often devalue disabled lives too. So pandemic, climate breakdown, a lot of it has similar systems of oppression in terms of how disabled people end up getting treated. So I next wanted to introduce this idea of ableism, which we started thinking about already in terms of what's happening to disabled lives. So for most disabled folks, ableism is the main thing that disables us. So it's at the root of disability. And Talila Lewis, in community with other BIPOC, has developed a working definition of ableism, which is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. And I'm just going to finish reading. I think we might have a slide change, but I'm going to finish reading the definition and then I'll go to, there was a cartoon about ableism as well. So the rest of this definition is: this is systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, health/wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So that's a bit of a mouthful because ableism has so many roots and so many interlinking systems that cause it. But basically, it causes oppression to disabled people based on non-disabled norms of how people are valued, in a nutshell. And we also have a cartoon on this slide, which shows a white man, a doctor, directing a question to a Black woman doctor, and neither of them are visibly disabled. And behind them, there's a group of disabled people who are being talked over. So the doctor asks, "What do you think they want?" And then there's thought bubbles, and you can see that the disabled people, there's a wheelchair user, somebody blind with a white cane and stuff. So there's different people, and they say, "To be treated with respect, information I can access, to be asked, and to make my own decisions." That image is by Crippen as the credit. So just an example of disabled people being talked over and belittled by non-disabled people as an example of ableism there. Cool. So now I want to go to our next key term, which is climate justice. All of this will start coming together a little bit later. So climate justice movements focus on the roots of climate breakdown. We've got a yellow flag here with the words climate justice now. If we focus only on reducing emissions, the structural norms propelling climate breakdown remain intact. So things like colonialism, capitalism, and extractive practices won't change if we're only purely focused on reducing emissions without looking at those roots. The fossil fuel industry puts profit before people. So 100 fossil fuel companies cause upwards of 2/3 of global fossil fuel and cement emissions. So most emissions. And 20 fossil fuel companies cause over 1/3 of emissions. This is research from the Climate Accountability Institute. They have a series called Carbon Majors 2020. So this really shows you the extent to which corporate profit-seeking practices are really, really driving climate change. So climate justice is about equity and responsibility to those disproportionately impacted. So that can be countries, it can be frontline communities, future generations, BIPOC, women, disabled people. It's about leaving no one behind. And disability justice is a crucial and often overlooked way, I will argue, to orient climate justice. I'll just grab a drink. Cool, so moving on to disability justice. So Sins Invalid is a San Francisco Bay Area disability justice based performance project celebrating multiply marginalized disabled artists. And 10 principles of disability justice have emerged from their work, which I'll be referring to. And for more, I highly recommend you check out Skin, Tooth, and Bone, a disability justice primer. So that's a text where they've got the 10 principles, but they've got a lot of other pieces as well that go into a lot more context and detail in specific areas. So here we've got an image, which shows words with various fonts on a watercolor background with veins that look like trees and layer clusters of bubbles that look like alveoli in the lungs. This is an image description that Sins Invalid have provided, by the way. And the text on the image says, so it goes through the principles. It says intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. So the text is by Patty Burns and Sins Invalid, and the design is by Nomi Lam. So moving on now we'll go through a few of these principles and connect them in with climate intersection. So intersectionality, first one. So intersectionality was developed, as you may know, by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist scholar. So everyone has multiple identities and different backgrounds and life experiences. And the thing about these is that they can result in privileges or they can result in oppression. And we are the sum of these experiences, these intersecting experiences and identities. And this image on this slide has a brown femme surrounded by 7 interlocking circles. Each is a different color, and they have the words race, religion, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender, and ethnicity there. So an example of how this ties in for disabled people within the climate crisis, Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Balser has written an excellent piece, which I highly recommend you read, called Disabled People Cannot Be Expected Losses in the Climate Crisis. And she explains in this piece that her colleague said, it's terrible, but what can you do? Some people just aren't going to make it. And Julia writes, If we persist in framing disability and climate change as a problem of physical vulnerability, we miss the underlying realities of structural violence, how ableism, racism, class inequality, and other forms of oppression work together to compound and intensify risk. So I think that shows really nicely how those intersections play on each other and make this principle really relevant for disabled people within climate breakdown. So climate movements also need narratives which locate injustice in many places all at once. So I'm quoting now from a quote within the book Brilliant Imperfection by Ellie Clare. I'm not too sure how to pronounce his name, but a queer disabled activist. So so climate movements need narratives which locate injustice in many places all at once, in coal burning, in extracting fossil fuels from the ground, in poisoning the planet and the many beings that make home here, including humans, in the racism and classism that force poor people and people of color to live and work near environmental destruction. Cancer and asthma would become not symbols, but lived realities amidst injustice. So then I just chose this quote as well because it's a really nice example of intersectional framing and not sort of tokenizing or using things like cancer and asthma as sort of fear tactics or, oh, you might get cancer, but understanding it in a much more intersectional, messy way where, the autonomy over disabled people's bodies is impinged upon. And here the image is of an oil derrick, like a drilling rig in the desert. And you can see the back of a man in an orange jumpsuit and a hard hat who's staring at that rig. So the next principle that we'll talk about is leadership of those most impacted. And Sins Invalid write about this principle, and they say, by centering the leadership of those most impacted, we keep ourselves grounded in real world problems and find creative strategies for resistance. So disabled people are disproportionately impacted by climate breakdown. Being disabled alone makes us more susceptible to the impacts of climate exacerbated extreme weather, displacement, and air pollution, etc. But this is more acute for multiply marginalized disabled people. So that can include people on low incomes or living in low income areas, people in conflict zones, BIPOC, people who are multiply disabled, people in institutions, etc., all kinds of factors that can make you more susceptible. And then when you're living at these intersections, then you're most impacted from colonization, extractivism, and profit-seeking practices, which are upholding climate change, as we talked about before. And the image here is a wheelchair user who's Black. It's a tricycle type wheelchair, is being assisted by a young man through floodwaters in Thailand. So disabled people, and just extending on this theme of disabled people being disproportionately impacted and explaining what that looks like a bit, disabled people are often excluded from planning processes, whether that's for wildfires, typhoons, heat waves, drought, floods, or forced displacement as well, or relocation of any kind, really. So these climate exacerbated events might mean many things. So I've got a list here. So it might mean our access to info and our ability to communicate may be severely impaired. Our bodies may not tolerate heat waves, smoke inhalation, or other sudden changes. We may lose the power we need for necessary medications or machines that they rely on. We may be adversely affected by food and water insecurity. Evacuation and transport access may be challenging or impossible for us, and shelters may not accommodate our access needs either. We may lose or be separated from key members of our support teams. And when resources are scarce, we might be expendable. So this is pretty heavy stuff. There's a lot of ways that if disabled people, if our expertise is not being incorporated into the planning for climate breakdown, for extreme weather, and for creating more climate resilient places, that we will be adversely impacted. So a little bit more on how climate breakdown exacerbates health inequities as well. So oil refineries and fracking facilities and other fossil fuel pollution from industry, vehicles, etc., give us less autonomy over our bodies. So that's going back to what Ellie Clare was saying in Brilliant Imperfection. So they exacerbate risks of developing cancer, asthma, cardiovascular diseases, and other long-term health conditions. And Lyme disease also is becoming more prevalent as temperatures are being driven up by climate breakdown. And of course, living on climate front lines also exacerbates mental distress. Let's have a quick drink. So I don't have time to go through all 10 principles of disability justice, but one other one I do want to explore, which is super relevant, is cross-movement solidarity. So climate and environmental campaigning movements must be accessible to and inclusive of disabled people in both objectives and practices. In this image, you have a deafblind person who's bending down, working with an interpreter, and they're exploring fluorescent smart paint on the asphalt. So part of making sure these movements are accessible to and inclusive of disabled people is rooting out eco-ableism. So that's ableism within environment, waste, and climate movements. So disability, solidarity, and eco-ableism. Looking at those intersections, the straw ban issue is ableist. So that really damaged trust between disabled people and environmental movements. It framed plastic pollution as an individual problem. So it devalued the needs of disabled people who absolutely rely on plastic straws to be able to drink. So that shows eco-ableism in action there. And there's similar, devaluing if you think about like plastic wrapped fruit and veggies, asthma inhalers, plastic medical equipment or packaging. So these things that disabled people really need to survive are getting targeted when the real culprits are corporate polluters, and when ultimately environmental movements are giving disabled people the idea that, reducing this tiny amount of plastic pollution is somehow more important than the actual necessities that they need for survival and for being able to participate in society. So that needs to go if disabled people are going to feel included or welcome. And there'll be some more examples of eco-ableism and how we can do things differently in the rest of the presentation as well. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit towards envisioning the future. This is the more hopeful section. So I've called this slide Envisioning the Future, Interdependence and Mobility Justice. And Sims and Ballard, when they talk about the principle of interdependence, describe that we see the liberation of all living systems and the land as integral to the liberation of our own communities, as we all share one planet. So I think that's a really lovely way to look at interdependence, not only between people, but also between people and land, people and planet. So part of that, and the part that we're focused on today with the Mobility Matters theme, is working towards public spaces and mobility which are accessible, welcoming, and safe for all, as well as being climate friendly. And yeah, climate and pandemic build back better intersections mean now is a really critical moment for this sort of reimagining as well. We've got a green plant with delicate flowers as an image on this slide. So Áine Himrai is a disabled scholar who's written a fantastic book called Building Access. And they ask in this book, who are we designing for and how do we know? And I think this is a critical question for designers, policymakers, and everyone involved in these mobility conversations to be asking all the time. The image here is there's a Black woman boarding paratransit, and the woman has a support cane. So before we go on to talk more specifically about disability-related accessible mobility, I just wanted to give a quote from the Untokening Collective as well, who talk about safety as, so they say, safety is more than protection from cars. When people live at the intersection of multiple vectors of oppression, unfettered access to mobility and public space are not guaranteed. Racism, sexism, classism, ableism, xenophobia, homophobia, and constraints imposed upon gender non-conforming folks can make the public space hostile to many. Bodies encounter different risks and have different needs. This is from the Untokening Collective, who have a set of principles of mobility justice. So that's really important to keep in mind as well, is that aspect of intersectionality we were talking about before. So I want to switch now a little bit to an example, which will become clearer why I'm bringing it up in a sec, which is curb cuts. So we got an image here of a curb cut of the ramp with the tactile ground surface indicators leading onto a street. So curb cuts are the quintessential symbol of disability design innovation, which is benefiting not just disabled people, but mothers with or parents who might have prams, or somebody who has broken their leg, or with a suitcase, or whatever you can think of like that. But also, curb cuts are a site of friction where access is negotiated. So in their book, Building Access, Áine Himrai talks about this and how wheelchair users and blind people worked together so that the flat transition from the sidewalk to the street would be marked with the tactile ground surface indicators, because otherwise curb cuts would not be so great for blind people, depending if you didn't know the area, then you could potentially accidentally find yourself on the road without knowing. So this shows that from the start, policymakers must treat disabled people and our representative organizations, and especially multiply marginalized disabled people, as design collaborators, so that we're all negotiating design together, rather than assuming that they may be able to, determine from research alone what is going to work. So having a really diverse group around the table, and also needing to budget for the ongoing engagement of disabled people in the development, implementing, and monitoring design as well. So through that entire process. So going on to a few more specific examples of what this could look like in some of the discussions happening at the moment. I think in a lot of countries, at least high-income countries, there's a big discussion around micro-mobility. The image we have here is people riding bikes in a bike lane. But so like cycling, e-scooters and other forms of micro-mobility offer alternate, relatively low emissions ways of getting around. But when they traverse the same space as pedestrians and wheelchair users, or are parked inappropriately, they pose hazards, as we probably all know. And this is compounded if walking-friendly speeds are not adhered to, particularly because they are quiet. So having separated cycling and micromobility lanes is a really great option. And there as well, it's really important that it's not only visually separated, but that there's a tactile indication of that separation as well. Another way, and again, this comes in, so that whole conversation around micromobility is really important for climate campaigning organizations to take into account. So when you're advocating for perhaps more cycling and e-scooter, access and things like that, to also consider how does that impact disabled people, children, older people, and anybody who might feel unsafe if they are not part of the design conversation. And here again, this next slide is about accessibility beyond public transport. So public transport being really, really critical, but not the only part of the picture. So what does that look like? Access is the whole journey. So it's getting to and from transport stops, if that's the mode of transport you're going to be using, finding the desired vehicle, getting on, traveling comfortably and safely, getting off and getting to the destination. But not everyone will take public transport. So some people rely on door-to-door options, which public transport generally doesn't do for you. So it's really important to ensure that mobility parking is not removed and that taxis, including mobility taxis, continue to be available as well. So that can be relevant for disabled people with a whole bunch of different access needs, but making sure that particularly for a lot of wheelchair users, they may find that their independence is much, much enhanced by being able to have a car, because public transport access is still so spotty. And even when it's a little bit better, there's just so many different aspects of accessibility, as mentioned in that whole journey, that having the car can really be the preferable option there. So it's important to make sure that being able to have the mobility parking and such, that remains available even as we go through these transitions, because more affordable and accessible and joined up public transport is still a great and very important thing. And on the hybrid and electric vehicles front, so minimum sound standards are critical for safety, which exist, as far as I understand, in the US now. Car subsidies also need to prioritize disabled people who need driving for independence, and car charging infrastructure needs to be physically accessible, and accessible in any other ways that might come up as well, to disabled people. And hybrids and EVs need to be designed and their batteries placed so that physical modifications of the vehicles are possible as well. So there's different aspects that need to be considered there from a design point of view. Cool, so I'm coming now to just some key messages to sum up what I've been talking about for the last 25 minutes or so. So we have to name and fight back against the systems that discount disabled people and treat our lives as less worthy. Whether it's climate, disability, or their intersections, we have to look to the root causes to advocate for justice for all. Following disability justice principles, we need to do this in an intersectional way led by those most impacted. Disabled people are disproportionately impacted by climate breakdown. These impacts are compounded by eco-ableism. We need cross-movement solidarity. We need public spaces and mobility which are accessible, welcoming, and safe for all, as well as climate friendly. We need to ask, who are we designing for and how do we know? And policymakers need to engage with and collaborate with disabled people early and often. If not, we'll be left behind. Thank you. And you can find me at my Twitter is at AINEKC95. So AINEKC95. my Facebook is AINE and then Kelly Costello, KELLYCOSTELLO. And my website is aframeonlife.com if you would like to get in touch at all. And on the Mobility Matters website, these slides will be uploaded. And on the final slide, there's a link to a suggested reading list if you'd like to dig into these topics a bit more and the references as well. Thank you very much.